just want to thank everybody for tuning in and watching or listening. But yeah, so again, I was talking about the Axeman, and the Axeman that I wrote about was actually just coming into real like mainstream popularity because of the program American Horror Story. And when I was writing the book, I was like, "Oh, this is great," because everybody's gonna be interested in the Axeman, and they mentioned Lake Charles, my hometown, in that series. And I was like, "Well, this is great. It's gonna do well for book sales, and it's not the same Axeman."
Not the same guy, right? So this is what I want to kind of come clean with my audience right out of the gate. This whole week that we've been kind of promoting this, we've been talking Axeman, Axeman, Axeman. And I know, just because I was this person once upon a time, that especially after American Horror Story Coven, whenever now you hear about the Axeman of New Orleans or the Axeman in Louisiana, you think about these series of murders that did happen. This was a real thing from the year 1918, maybe going into a little bit of 1919. But basically, there's a series of attacks by, we presume, a single male figure. He sneaks into people's houses late at night, tries to murder everybody with an axe. Sometimes he's successful, sometimes he's not. There's really no great eyewitness account. I think we wind up with 6 victims and 6 others that are wounded but do survive. And then in true sort of mythical serial killer fashion, he vanishes. One day the killings just stop. They never really did identify who it was. Certainly, like Jack the Ripper, there's a whole lot of speculation as to why the killings were happening in the first place, what the motives are. In New Orleans, at least in 1918, most of the victims are Italian Americans. So, of course, we bring in the mafia, which is heavy in New Orleans in that period. So it's possible it could have been a Black Hand issue.
Yeah, and
but
I address that in the book. I talk about the New Orleans, which was several years after the original Louisiana Axeman murders.
Right, and that's what's so wild is that nobody knows about these other murders. And so reading your book, I'm thinking, oh, well, maybe there's a few murders. No, there's like the Axeman of New Orleans, we all know, is the postscript at the end of the story. It's and you surmise, and we'll get to this, but you think it's likely a copycat killer of the original serial killer.
Right. The New Orleans Axeman murder definitely was a copycat serial killer, playing on the fears of what was already in the culture at the time, that the Axeman. And it wasn't just New Orleans, or in Louisiana, where the murders were happening in Louisiana and Texas. People were fascinated by this trail of dead bodies from a serial killer in 1911, 1912. They were transfixed on this story, and it was in the headlines in major newspapers across the United States at the time. And the only thing that knocked the Axeman murders out of the mainstream media at the time was the sinking of the Titanic. When the Titanic sank, it was kind of like that became the news, and people forgot about the original Axeman murders. But yeah, it was pretty terrifying.
Mm-hmm. And so this is what's wild is that so first we've got to back up really 7 years before those murders that happened in New Orleans, right? 1911, I think, is our first incident.
Right.
And forgive me, I will say the timeline in the book jumps around back and forth, which I really like because you uncover the cases almost as the investigators uncovered them, and kind of as you uncover them as you were looking from one to the next to the next.
Right. Yeah.
But what starts us out? Do we start out in Lake Charles, Louisiana? Where's the first Axeman murders?
Well, the first Axeman murders actually take place in small town Louisiana, outside of Lafayette, and in Lafayette and in Crowley, Louisiana.
Mm-hmm.
They were sort of moving along. And the reason I started with the Lake Charles murders is because it was, at the time, it was probably one of the most gruesome, and it was the only significant time in the trail of murder and mayhem where the killer actually left a message and left like clues. And that was my hometown. So, I mean, flash forward like a couple years after college, I'm reading true crime story, anthology, encyclopedia. It's called Raising Hell. Pretty sure it's still in print. It's about satanic crime It's an encyclopedia of satanic crime.
Mm-hmm.
And I was fascinated with reading about true crime at the time. And what do? I open up to first page A for the encyclopedia, the way that it was written.
Right.
And I see A for Axe, an Axeman. And it mentions my hometown. And I'm like, wait, what is this? I've never heard of this. So, I couldn't stop thinking about it and the message that was left behind and the family that was murdered, family of 5 murdered in their sleep. And that was the MO for the Axeman. He killed not just you, but your entire family while you slept. And a lot of people speculate and wonder, how could someone kill a family of 5 in their sleep, in their beds at night, without rousing other family members or anything like that? So it gets to be a really strange story. But I really first picked it up and started studying from my hometown's perspective, from the Lake Charles murders on. Because after the Lake Charles murders, there was, right before then, there was some pretty significant arrests made. And as far as like New Orleans history, there is a connection to Louisiana Axeman murders, and which I understand is from about 1911 to 1912, you're getting small towns, Rayne, Louisiana, Lafayette, Crowley, and then by January of 1912, the killer gets to Lake Charles, which is a steady. It's almost like traveling down Interstate 10 West nowadays.
Right. For those of y'all that don't live here in Louisiana, Lafayette really sits right in kind of the center of the state when you imagine it, and then Lake Charles is way out close to the Texas border. We joke that's the last bastion of Louisiana civilization before you head into Texas. So yeah, I mean, obviously the murders kind of start in central Louisiana and they're slowly moving west.
Yeah.
But they don't stop in Lake Charles. And in fact, they cross that Texas border.
They continue into Texas. And I believe that the same killer or killers continued on through the good portion of the Midwest and all over the United States, actually.
I know
in
one
my opinion, the story, the true crime story that I wrote about, it's really like a compendium of news articles. So, and it's the first book ever written on this series of murders. And it's good because you don't have to go, you don't have to do a lot of like newspaper research because I pretty much put all that in one book, like a one-stop shop for you. With theories and things like that I put, because I learned some things while I was writing it. So I figured, well, if I'm learning things while I'm writing it, people are going to learn things while they're reading it. And when I sign my books, I always sign, keep seeking the truth. I always encourage people to, do your own research and hey, hit me up, send me a message of what you found. I think it'd be interesting to sort of collectively solve this thing. I mean, it's hard to write about 100-year-old crime when there's no witnesses really.
Right. Nobody's still alive that remembers it. Right.
You have to go by the old newspapers and stuff.
Well, and something we should say, something that made these early murders very different than the ones that happened in New Orleans is, and correct me if I'm wrong, but certainly the majority, if not the entirety of the victims in 1911 and 1912 are Black, are African American, right?
Of mixed race descent.
Sure.
There was, and back then they used outdated terms like mulatto.
Right.
And you see that all through the old newspaper article clippings. But yeah, it started out, one theory that was, kind of tossed around out there was that it was this church from New Orleans. They were called the Church of the Sacrifice, and they actually practiced, very much Old Testament human sacrifice. And
nothing ominous about that at all.
Right.
Yeah.
There was a little bit of hoodoo and things like that in Louisiana. Voodoo, and man, it was quite potent for back in the day. Now, this Church of the Sacrifice in New Orleans, I haven't been able to find out a lot about this historical church, but it was believed that they were sort of like, if you want to think like in the context of the one theory that was being kicked around, was this was done by Black folks who didn't like to see mixed race couples and children.
Right.
And that's why they were sort of a Black purist, murderous cult out there. But I surmised through my research and everything that all of the victims in this case lived within about a block or two, sometimes right on the railroad track. I mean, and I focus on that in the book. Some people say that they believe that this was something, a conspiracy done by the railroad people to terrify black folks to move away from their land, and that they could buy all the land around the railroad track.
So let's talk about that for a minute, because there are certainly in these early murders, when you leave New Orleans out as kind of an outlier that happens years and years later, there are definitely similarities. I mean, we don't really coin the term serial killer for another half century, but there's a pattern here, and that's of course what they sort of train you to look for. So we know they're all African Americans, usually of mixed race heritage. Usually it's families of 5, though occasionally there's a 4 or a 6. But it seems like families were being targeted, and we'll get into the sort of 5 connection. I know there's a lot there. We'll get back to that in just a second. But then absolutely, then they're all right next to this railroad track, which would have been the Southern Pacific Railroad, right? The one that kind of heads out to California through Texas. And so I know that you're absolutely right. That was one of the first theories that gets thrown out, is that, well, maybe it's just intimidation on the part of the company, because that way they're kind of encouraging people to move away from the railroad tracks, which lets them buy that land and kind of expand their influence. I'm with you in that. Sure, as an initial theory, I mean, I guess we're at least connecting it to the railroad. But it seems, of all the ways to intimidate a group of people into selling their property, this is a kind of pretty far out there on the list. Yeah, I mean, it's really wild. Seems like there would have been easier ways to just intimidate some people to sell you their land.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it was gruesome murders, crime scenes. We actually see some of the earliest accounts of the killer or killers posing the dead corpses at the crime scene, which time is unheard of. Now, you also have to think, too, that as far as the railroad plays into this, 1912, at the peak of the Axeman murders, rail was still kind of like nationwide rail was still kind of less than 100 years old at the time. So, a serial killer, maybe that's why we saw an uptick in serial killers at the time, because you could murder somebody, on a train and disappear, next night, the first time kind of in history. You can do that, and maybe so, but then the other theory of riding the rails just out of convenience kind of plays. It looms large. That theory more so than any looms large in my book, I think, because I do narrow it down to one suspect, and his reasoning for doing maybe what he did is just bizarre.
Right, and I do think it's the first time we see, but really in any kind of true crime study, this idea that a killer or killers would use the railroad, right? Would travel so as to avoid capture, to go from town to town to town. Right. I mean, really.
And some of you may be listening or watching and wondering, why is this significant? Why should I read this book? Because it's it's my theory, this is very much possibly the largest unsolved serial killing in U.S. history. Without a doubt. Right.
I had always been, and I know I'm seeing a few of the people that have logged on who are also, how do I say this in a way that doesn't make us all sound like serial killers, right? Who have been fascinated with the idea of H.H. Holmes, right, up in sort of Chicago. H.H. Holmes, for those of you that don't know, is largely considered kind of America's first serial killer. Of course, Jack the Ripper in London is the guy that kind of kicks this whole notion off. And that's the 1880s, 1888. And then a few years later, you get H.H. Holmes in Chicago, in the Midwest. And then we could do a whole other episode on the theories that link Jack the Ripper and H.H. Holmes, and suggestions they were the same person, which I don't really believe. But when you get to the history of this, right, we kind of point to him. We say Holmes is the first American serial killer. And then it doesn't really enter this sort of larger public consciousness really until we get into, what I call the Mindhunter days, when we're starting to deal with guys like the BTK killer. And so we're talking the 1960s into the 1970s at that point. And yet here in between those times, you've got this crazy killing spree of literally dozens of people that just sort of flies under everyone's radar.
Yeah. The serial killer, the Axeman, in my book, has a kill count greater than most of the popular serial killers that we know.
Right.
I mean,
yeah, right. It's a warm feeling for everybody at home that we know of, right?
That we know of. But yeah, definitely more than like the ones we do know about: BTK, Ted Bundy, Dahmer. I mean, when you get up to around, I would say it was 50 or more victims that the Axeman had under his axe.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that is very significant, and the country was gripped with fear.
Mm-hmm.
In this, and especially in Louisiana, especially in the black community, they were terrified of what was going on. And I think that eventually, definitely was felt in New Orleans. Another reason why it becomes significant to start my book, I think, in Lake Charles, is because of the message left behind. And then right before that, there were arrests made. Okay, so three people were arrested, and it was in Jennings, Louisiana,
mm-hmm.
which is, the Bayou murders, the Bayou 8 down there, pretty much that same part of the world.
Right.
And in Jeff Davis Parish, you have 3 arrests, 2 preachers, 2 priests, African American priests from a church called, Sacrifice Church of New Orleans. And it's also said that, I don't know if this was just put on for the white folks to stoke fear in the black community, but they were saying it's linked to, this church has links to voodoo and all this, and so the arrests were made, and this one woman from St. Martinville, which is just outside of Lafayette,
mm-hmm.
Was arrested and confessed to being the killer, and They let the 2 men go, the 2 priests. But I thought it was interesting that it was priests who were arrested, and then the message left behind after the arrest, the next murder to occur was in Lake Charles, and a biblical quote was left there.
Right. So
but you have someone who confesses, and she's a woman. And if you ever get a chance to research Clementine Barnabette, very fascinating. She could be the first confessed serial killer. Doesn't mean she did it. First female serial killer in American history, maybe, that we know of. But she's definitely a fascinating character. But I don't know if she was one. And I speculate in my book that one of the real reasons the Lake Charles murders had to happen. And I mean, the people in Lake Charles watched it slowly creep. These murders start to creep across the land.
mm-hmm.
They've already discussed the rails that the Lafayette sheriff was saying that he first got the inkling that I think the killer's riding the rails. And so with the coming hard winter, you get people very much paranoid in my hometown of Lake Charles in 1912.
Right.
And coming from town to town, following the murders, was this strange band of like African American gypsies, hoodoo, medicine men, things like that.
Yeah, almost like snake oil salesmen. Yeah.
A lot of lightning rod salesmen, divining rods.
Right.
Like all following this sort of, it was like a media circus back then. For 1912, people were terrified. And then, all the white folks in Lake Charles, in these towns, they were already scared of the Axeman. But then all these, other black folks start coming in and they're selling strange conjures.
It does. It kicks up this sort of circus atmosphere.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it got crazy. And
right.
then, I think the climactic kill and the high point in the story, and that's why I started with it,
mm-hmm.
was the Lake Charles murder. Yeah.
So let's dig into that one. So I promised readers some graphic descriptions here. So let's use that one as our template. We won't go to all of them, but
okay. So the town is kind of going nuts. People are being arrested wrongly.
Mm-hmm.
There's a mania that's building up. The Axeman is coming. And so a family of 5, Felix Broussard's family in Lake Charles, and I actually believe I found where the house was located. I went there,
mm-hmm.
and there's a winding back track for the train itself running through their yard. If you go there today, it's still there. And that's the interesting thing about the rails. They're still there from
Right.
more than 3 years ago. And cold winter night. I read the old newspapers, 1912. Fruit, vegetables were freezing. It was obviously frigid that night. That a family of 5 was butchered, hacked to death. The newspaper described it as brained with an axe.
Right.
The families were all brained with an axe, and I submitted a theory that because the crime scenes always kind of looked alike, families usually in their beds, hacked to death, some while they believe were still sleeping. The axe was always left behind. The murder weapon was always left behind.
Right.
So I just kind of reasoned things out and figured the axes that the murderer was using was the family's own home axe, because especially in 1912, everybody had an axe because everybody needed firewood.
Exactly. Right.
That was heating back then. So the killer would go because it's easier to not travel the rail with an axe, and you can be less inconspicuous without an axe.
Right.
Can't stress that enough.
Right.
So the killer arrives at these families' homes in the middle of the night. There's the axe. It's always in the same place by the woodshed, by the wood pile. Usually the killer always creeps in through the back door or the kitchen window. And but the strange thing was how were they killing 5 people without waking any of the kids up? Things
Right.
like that. It was a mother and father and like 3 children. And then the killer decided to leave a message on the back door of the home. The back door of the home was open the next morning, and you get strange little bits of information coming in, like through eyewitness accounts at the time. Everybody was paranoid and on high alert, and a lot of hobos and things like that were traveling the country at the time. And there was one lady that reported she heard a man going to sleep underneath her house in the middle of the night. She could hear him underneath the pier and beam.
Oh, right. I remember she could hear him snoring.
I
Right.
kind of thought that was creepy, but yeah, he's snoring, and who knows if that was our killer? We don't know. Maybe he just slept one off. But the thing is that the message left on the back door was a biblical quote straight out of the Old Testament. And he who maketh the inquisition for blood, he forgetteth not the cry of the humble. And that's the quote. But then signing the quote, it says human 5.
Yeah.
So
human 5.
Not the cry of the humble human 5. So then we're supposed to think, oh, is this a cult? Is this 5 people who did this?
Right.
But then we see the killer is kind of fascinated with the number 5. Always families of 5. Sometimes it's a 6 because there's probably the odd kid there, a baby. We're talking about a killer who didn't stop with babies.
Right. That's, I think, the worst one is the when there's 6 murders, it's because the family was a family of 5. They just happened to have one of the family friends was staying over. Like literally there was another child there that was not part of the family, was just staying over at a friend's house and happens to be there on the night of the murder. And so we get 6. But family wise, if you're the Axeman plotting these things in advance, you were, again, your target was a family of 5. So yeah, that number again and again and again.
And another strange thing is the dead bodies were found with pieces of wood sort of wedged between their fingers of their hands.
Right. Yeah, like this.
So that their hands were always open when they were found dead. 5.
5, exactly.
Yeah. Very strange. What does that mean? I play into it, some theories, and toss that around like in the book. But from that story, I kind of backtrack into what led up to this, and then into Texas. Because you have to understand, the Lake Charles murders basically said, hey, look, Clementine Barnabet did not do it. The woman who confessed to the crimes, African-American woman, could not have been in Lake Charles because she was in jail.
She was in jail for other Axeman murders, exactly.
Even though she confessed. And then that's when people started saying, well, this is a death cult. There's a bunch of them out there.
Right.
And I don't know if I totally discount that, because look at some of the first suspects. They're preachers, and that ties into, much more into the chapter a little bit later on. And I don't want to give away the whole book.
Right.
Yeah.
But there's another quote that's from the Bible that comes into play there about the trees bearing bad fruit.
Oh, yeah.
Right, and that it's your Christian responsibility to literally take an axe to those trees that bear bad fruit, and so that's kind of where that notion that it might be this sort of fringe cult of African American people who have decided that anyone of mixed race is a bad fruit, is impure, and so literally it's almost eugenics by axe, through several Louisiana towns.
And the other shoe fits on the other foot.
Right.
Like with white folks who might be that fundamental.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Which sort of brings us, I guess, around to the Barnabots, and this is the most fascinating thing because unfortunately, if you Google Clementine Barnabot, she's got a very tiny Wikipedia stub, but that's basically it. And so we keep kind of coming back to her as this potential axe woman. But it's so much more complicated than that because one of the suspects that had been arrested previously, and if I'm not mistaken, it's literally one of these preachers that we're talking about, these first two, is Clementine Barnabot's father, right?
Oh, no, but I mean, he was certainly
at one point he's a suspect.
Yeah, he was.
And Clementine confesses that her father is the Axeman.
Right.
And then while he's in jail, there's a killing. So they let him go, and then later on they arrest Clementine instead. And then while Clementine's in jail, there's a killing. It's just like they can't catch a break. These investigators.
Yeah, I think and this is really an early case in American history where we start to see maybe the first sort of steps toward like forensic really investigation.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't really have a lot of that, and the detectives back then, they were okay, but you get a lot from like traveling reporters. Which I thought was interesting too.
Mm-hmm.
There's even photographs of the homes where it took place. But one thing what I thought was interesting was, Barnabot's family, her brother and her father were all kind of mixed up in this. And you have to think, Louisiana 1912, religion back then was like a form of entertainment. I mean, that was what you did on a Friday or Saturday night.
Right.
And you see a series of like tent revivals coming to towns before a lot of these murders happen. And so you start thinking, well, maybe they're going to these towns, they're meeting everyone, they're kind of getting familiar and picking targets. Like, imagine a serial killer, if you will, like holding, tent revivals on the side of the road to figure out who their next victim is. Right,
to bring families in and find his victims and then go. Right, there's a lot of big theories about that. I know Clementine mentions, and this is something I wanted to ask you about, while she's in prison, and of course, her confession sort of changes a few times, which also kind of calls her reliability into question, because the story does change as time goes on. But at one point, she mentions being part of a group of either 4 or 5 people. It's a little confusing whether it's her and another woman and 2 men, or her and 2 women and 2 men, which would make up our 5. But what I was curious about, what I didn't get to ask you is, would Clementine have been aware of that human 5 element? Like, was that circulated among the press, or?
Yeah, I mean, because especially before the Lake Charles murder,
mm-hmm.
you had in the towns where she's living, word would have traveled fast to Rayne and Lafayette. Lafayette's just right outside of St. Martinville,
mm-hmm.
Crowley. All that is just Cajun country right there. And word would have gotten around. They would have all certainly been talking about it. Plus, you have some hoodoo medicine man being arrested in New Iberia, which is all still the same part of the state.
Right.
And I think she would have. Yeah, I think she would have. If there had been a cult or something like that, she would have been certainly in the know. One of the reasons she was arrested was because when she found out about the Lafayette family that was murdered, and that was actually the 6th, the overnight
mm-hmm.
family with 6 people who were slaughtered the same exact way by an axe in the middle of the night in their homes, in their beds. There was Clementine, and she was laughing out loud
mm-hmm.
in public,
mm-hmm.
very much not empathetic with what had happened, and everybody in the community was shocked. but not Clementine.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Well, and it's almost like there's a point in the book where you feel like, well, it's got to be her. I mean, it's just it seems almost open and shut. She has confessed. There are other eyewitnesses that say, oh yeah, she did it. She talked about doing it. They find clothing that's got blood and brains on it that somehow they managed to match to one of the victims, and that blew my mind because I didn't even realize we had the forensic capability of making those sorts of matches in 1912. But
yeah, and the thing is, she talks very much in gruesome, gory detail about killing infant children.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean,
well, and that's the one too. That's the same murder where they find them posed, right? Where the family, literally the mother and father, are posed as if they're kneeling in front of a bed praying, and then on the bed is the remainder of the family, right? All the children. And she talks in her confessions about being the person that posed them. And so, you get to this point and you think, well, it's got to be Clementine. She's at least involved. And then yet, while she's sitting there in prison, we get more murders. And they follow the same pattern. It doesn't seem to be a copycat. And she does. Now, she is convicted for some of them. Right?
Yeah, she went to Angola.
Right. I saw a thing. I don't know if this is true or not. Certainly, it wasn't in your book. It's just in some other incidental research. But there's a suggestion she escaped from Angola.
No. Okay. So there's a professor from up north in Kentucky. And he came down to visit me. He was transfixed with this case, and he came down, wanted to meet with me, and he also wanted to come down and go through Louisiana State Archives. And he was really researching Clementine.
Mm-hmm.
And he found out, and this is kind of an update to my book about what happened to her. She eventually was released from Angola Women's Prison.
Oh, really? She just walked?
Yeah, and that's very strange. I want to say that it was almost like a type of pardon. Like she was pardoned. Like it had to have been some sort of political.
Fascinating.
I think. I mean, like kind of a governor's pardon. That's
right.
But while she was in prison, I do know other strange little details about the case that the professor shared with me. Was that she was given a female circumcision, mutilation of the genitals, and while in women's prison in Angola, Louisiana. So, but then she was released and spent her final days. I think she ended up going back to St. Martinville. Yeah,
just sort of disappears into history, right? Yep. And again, I certainly want everybody watching to buy this book. So we're not going to give away what your sort of final theory is, but eventually your sort of assertion, and I think a lot of other people kind of fall behind this, is that eventually they track down one person who turns out also to be potentially a traveling preacher, or at least had dabbled in it at one point. This kind of strikes me as another sort of itinerant ne'er-do-well. So he's going to claim to be whatever gets him in the door, one of those guys. But what's... Yeah.
And he would have been familiar with Jack the Ripper. He was from England.
Yeah, he was from England. Yeah, exactly. So he knew all about those serial killers. But and again, I don't want to kind of give everything away, but there's some pretty strong evidence that potentially he could be the culprit behind a lot of these murders. I know specifically, and we haven't even touched on this, towards the end of this streak, we get even outside of Texas, and we wind up in Iowa. And there's a murder that happens in Iowa that's along the same MO, the same details, etc. And that's the one that gets this particular suspect arrested, right? Right.
Yeah, and so for those of you who are wondering, who the hell are they talking about? What the hell are they talking about? Look, when I was writing the book, and look, my theory is it was this guy, and he did it. But, some people say, oh, I disagree with you. And you know what? I don't care. I don't care. It's a 100-year-old crime, for God's sake. I just kind of thought it was a good ending to the book because I had discovered it while I was writing the book. I had no idea about Villisca, Iowa. And if you Google Villisca, Iowa, the first thing you're going to see is Villisca, Iowa murder house. And you can actually stay there like a bed and breakfast where a gruesome series of get this, kids, a family of 5 or so hacked to death with axes in their sleep.
Right.
And reading the crime sort of report in the newspaper from back then, when I was reading it, I mean, I had already been reading over and over again the Louisiana and Texas cases. When I read the Iowa case, which was totally new to me, I was like, oh my God, this is the same guy. It's the same exact guy.
Right.
Same way of doing things. Strangest thing, though, about what we see happening, and I want to say it's Villisca. The pork belly.
I knew you were going to bring up the bacon. Oh, I knew that was what you were going to say.
Yeah. The slab of bacon on the side of the bed. I thought that was strange. So it's the same sort of MO, same crime scene that we saw in Louisiana. Strange thing, I guess, the mirrors were covered up in the house.
Oh, that hit me so strongly, because obviously my specialty, my real focus of interest is sort of ghost, paranormal, and so true crime kind of comes in as a tangent to that. But that notion of covering mirrors, that's straight Victorian spiritualism, where you drape all of the mirrors in black cloth so that the souls don't get trapped there. One of our guides used to be a guide at the Myrtles Plantation, and that's one of their big haunted artifacts is a mirror that supposedly was uncovered while a death was going on in the house. And so now we have this haunted mirror. So it's fascinating that suddenly there's this kind of cult spiritualism going on that is very specifically taking its cues from Victorian England, which again ties right back into this guy's nationality. I mean, that's where he comes from.
We see for the first time that it's white folks are being slaughtered wholesale.
Right. And that's the other thing, is that in Iowa, the first time the victims are white.
Yeah. So, but yeah, I mean, it's a very curious case where, we see, someone of religious authority, a preacher, and look, I'll just say this, we have yet another confession. And comes from a man of God, so you've got to believe that, right? And when they asked him why he killed a family of 4 or 5 in the middle of the night in Villisca, Iowa, with an axe, he said that he heard a voice. He saw a black figure or something that led him out into he saw a figure on the lawn. It was very strange.
Right.
He heard a voice that said 2 words: slay utterly.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, it still runs chills up my
Yeah, I mean,
hear that.
you got to look at it. One of 2 things is true. I mean, either this guy is telling us the literal truth, which is just terrifying to think about, that there might have been some sort of otherworldly or supernatural force that is driving some of these killings. Or if we take the supernatural out of it at all, I mean, this is a very disturbed, probably dissociative guy who is having literally visual and auditory hallucinations that are driving him to mass murder. I mean, that's the kind of schizophrenic that everybody is terrified about. You talk about, that's not really what schizophrenia is, except 1 out of every million cases. And this guy just happens to be that 1 in a million. But he gets off, right? He gets a hung jury, doesn't he?
Yeah, I mean, you can't hang a white man for a crime like that back then, and especially a man of God. There were people who had real, so there again, hung jury. They couldn't find guilty. He walks. So we still have sort of a unsolved crime in Villisca as well. And then if you and I met some really great people, like Mr. Epperly up there in Villisca, Iowa, who's done the research. There were people that were doing this research on these crimes years before I came along.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And they when I first introduced myself, it's the first time in the history of these crimes we're linking the South and the North in the series of murders.
Mm-hmm.
It's easy when you have history and newspapers in 1-dimensional or 2-dimensional frames of reference for this. You just think, well, it's all regional. This just happened here in my hometown. But then when you step back and you see the bigger picture, this was happening all over the country.
Right.
And it just made headlines in Villisca and Louisiana and Texas, but it was happening all over. and you see a bigger picture. And that to me is also eerie, that this spree of murder, heinous murders, was just happening. And no one could do anything to stop it.
Right, and there's not a whole lot of, and that was another one of those senses I got reading your book. There's not a lot of interstate communication between these law enforcement. It's not like the feds show up and the FBI takes over the case because they're not around.
None of that.
Yeah. Right, but we don't even get. I mean, as far as I was reading, Beaumont. When we think the killer is headed to Beaumont, they kind of get a little fired up. I was joking. I lived in Houston for several years, so in pure Texan fashion, they buy another gun and say, "Bring it on, we're waiting for you." We'll give you a nice warm Texas welcome if you show up. And yet, 2 days later, there's 5 more people dead.
Yeah.
But it happens as well after the Axeman killings in New Orleans in 1918. So one of the theories there is that the reason they stop is because the Axeman leaves the city and heads towards California. And you can follow again along certain rail lines these incidents of people being attacked or assaulted with an axe. And eventually we get out to California and one of our primary suspects winds up getting shot in an alternate sort of altercation. And that's the end of the murders. And we think, oh, that means this guy must be the Axeman too. But I think in the absence of that, Federal Bureau of Investigation or any sort of, nobody had their eye on the big picture. Everybody was only looking at it locally. And so even when sort of Texas and Lake Charles start cooperating with one another, that's noteworthy because that didn't happen back then.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. If the killer left your town, that was good. I mean, at least he's gone. That's all you really needed.
And I don't think I think the reason the Axeman did not go to Houston, because at the time Houston was having a bad, I think, yellow fever problem.
Mm-hmm.
So it was pretty much polluted.
Well, that's something else that I've been thinking about this week is that when you look at the New Orleans cases that happened later, those happened mostly from May to October of 1918. And of course, right now, that's a period of time we're all kind of focused on for an entirely different reason. That's the same time the Spanish flu is going around. Yeah. And so, that's it. It made me think about those particular murders in New Orleans in a different context as well, because we would have been, we weren't under strict stay-at-home orders or quarantines or anything like that, but that was very much a global situation that was going on at that time. And so, when I was thinking about these poor people in New Orleans who are already dealing with a global pandemic and suddenly have a serial killer pop up, and then the serial killer starts writing crazy letters about play jazz or I'm going to murder you. I mean, the atmosphere in the city must have just been terrifying to behold.
I acknowledge the New Orleans Axeman. I really believe that was one of the first examples of like organized crime making like these hits, these killings in New Orleans at the time. I mean, you throw in jazz and it's just like, it's almost like he was trying to race bait a little bit with jazz. I don't know. I've
always wondered if that letter was even written by the killer. Could have been written by anybody, they could have just sent it in. And because it doesn't, when you look at the text of that letter, it doesn't give any details that would identify the killer as the killer. He's not talking about murders that are going to happen and then they happen. He's not giving details that only the police knew. He basically just says, you can't catch me because I'm a demon. The police have figured that out, which is why they're not trying very hard. And so now, because I've got this sense of humor, I'm going to offer you this deal. And so that's when the Axeman's jazz was about. And of course, nobody dies that particular Tuesday, March 19th at 12:15 a.m., which is when he says he's going to fly over the town.
Right.
And there's a period of time, there's a couple of weeks, I think, before the next murder, where the city thinks maybe they played enough jazz music that this guy was satisfied. And then, no, sure enough, we wind up with another murder, and then he just disappears. But that could have been anybody that wrote that letter, because of course by 1918 now, we're looking at Jack the Ripper being 30 years old, and of course everybody knows Jack the Ripper's from hell letters. The Axeman's letter is also addressed from hell, so there's a similarity there between the Saucy Jack letters. So I think that would be hard to prove for any one of us in 2020 doing this investigative work to say this definitely came from the murderer.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I just love that there's interest and sort of fascination with Louisiana history that way. You know, like whether it's dark or gruesome.
Right.
And sort of tying in the New Orleans Axeman with this Axeman. I mean, it's good common ground to like. You know, I've even written a couple of screenplays to try to get this made into like a series, and I would still like to see that like a kind of a period piece. But this is the kind of story that like you don't hear about too often, and that's kind of like one thing I wanted to do when I started writing was, you know, unearth sort of oddball history that nobody really knows and kind of make that popular.
Right.
And that's what I hope to do with this. And, you know, I mean, I sure would appreciate if you would give it a read, and then if you read it, give it a 5-star review, you know?
Yes, please. Oh my gosh, review everything on Amazon. Give it 5 stars.
Yeah, I just think it's a book, it's a story that could catch on with everyone, because I just remember when I was, you know, first stumbling upon this story and everything, and people have introduced it to, like before I even had the book written, I had a file, you know, and I'd tell people about it, and they would just get wrapped up in it, like, tell me more.
Well,
You know, and that's the way it is, and I wish people would find it a little more fascinating.
Well, the rabbit hole is so deep. I mean, that's the thing. We're scratching the surface here. I wanted to tease one more little thing about your suspect, and then we'll stop talking about him so people will buy the book. But when we talk about him getting off, it's not really that he's declared not guilty. It's an 11-1 jury, right? So it's a hung jury. So he walks, and it's based on one dissenting juror. And there's a theory which I love, because this is the kind of conspiracy theory that I'm here for. Is the notion that this particular suspect may have been a Freemason. And the idea is that he pulled his Freemason strings to get that one guy to hang the jury, and he walks, or maybe the judge is a Freemason. But there's a notion that maybe he's protected in that regard as well, not just being a white man in 1912 being accused of these murders when every other victim is in black, but also he may have these sort of secret society connections and things like that, right? And so again, it's like every place you turn, there's some weird angle that being considered. So
Reverend Kelly, definitely a creepy guy. Reverend Kelly is kind of like the American Jack the Ripper. And I want to say, I don't know, I haven't read my book in a while, but he was made a Mason, I think, in the United States.
Right. Well, you talk about the fact that he's originally from Ireland, I think. And he talks about being from the part of Ireland that allows him to be a Freemason. In other words, he's Protestant Irish. He's not Catholic Irish. Right. Then, you know, coming into Louisiana, being a very heavily Catholic state, you know, that's a pretty interesting thing. Then he runs up to Iowa, kind of in Protestant country, the Bible Belt, and there he kind of walks scot-free. Right? Despite having confessed. Again, we have another killer who confesses to the crime and somehow was not brought to justice for it.
Right, and he wrote a book, and the only copy of that book that exists is in Texas, I think it's Texas A&M University Library.
Wow.
Which kind of puts him in Texas, where a lot of these murders happened as well.
So we're coming up kind of at the 9 o'clock hour. I'll do our little commercial. Monitoring the comments as much as I can. I see that we've got a few, I think, aspiring serial killers, so I'm glad we're doing a service to society here. But I don't see a whole lot of questions. I'm afraid that some questions may have gotten lost in the first live stream. So folks, if you've got any questions, please leave them in the comment thread. If you want to skip the line and kind of get a shout out from us, you can always Venmo any amount of money into our tip jar. That's at No Secrets Tours. That'll get you right at the top of the list. But I'll kick it off because there's definitely a couple of questions that I want to ask you about. And one is that I feel like we would not do our mature content warning justice if we didn't talk about the bacon. But we'll go about it a roundabout way. Let's, you know where the punchline is. But so to go back to that question, how is this guy getting into these homes. And you got to think back then, when we talk about a family of 5, it's not like it's a big ranch style house where everybody's spread out among all these rooms. You're talking about 2-room cottages where, the kids are all sleeping in one bed and the parents are sleeping in the other. And they're all within sort of line of sight of one another. So the idea that this guy could kind of tiptoe in and kill 5 people without any one of them getting up and making a run for it or managing to cry out or anything,
Right.
is pretty staggering. So I'll let you kind of kick us off as to the theories that start to come out about that, and then I want to try to connect this to the murders in New Orleans. Yeah.
Yeah. So one thing that the investigators in Lake Charles noticed, they were getting a lot of reports of damp cloths being left around window seals, like on the windows at the time, on the outside, and that holes were being drilled into these. I mean, they were shacks. These people lived in very ramshackle cabins back in the day, and the holes were being drilled into these homes. They couldn't explain that, but it's very possible that some substance, gas, like
Like chloroform, ether, something like that, right?
Could be poured into the home, but the fact that we see a slab of bacon, like a huge pork belly, wrapped in cheesecloth on the side of the bed where a family was just murdered, probably wasn't the family bringing bacon into the room
right.
that. But then again, you never know.
Mm-hmm.
However, I speculate in the book that if it is a priest, if it is a preacher going from town to town, holding revivals, getting to know some families, how can a priest get into a home and do this? And the way is if you present to the family, you feed these poor people, you bring food to their home. And I believe that the bacon was probably poisoned or
drugged, or right.
Mm-hmm. Like a drugging agent was put into the bacon, and the family ate this. And it's believed that whether it be drugs or poison, that's why the family did not rouse from their sleep, didn't scream out, they didn't wake one another up. They stayed in their beds where they were lying and took axe blows, into their pillows.
Right.
And now one guy, Dr. Epperly, is very fond of believing that the killer was a sick, twisted maniac.
Yes, something of a sexual deviant, I think is the way it's described, right?
And he used...
Todd, if you're embarrassed, I'm shameless. I'm happy to volunteer this piece of information to our audience.
Okay. No, it's a challenge to try to explain.
To try to say it with a straight face. Well, so this is the gist. Tell me if I'm missing any details. I'll have you fill them in. No pun intended. But so the idea is that he brings in this big 5-pound slab of pork, right, bacon, and then they find this piece that's cut off and wrapped in cheesecloth and then basically stashed by the bed of one of the murder victims.
Yeah, there's a huge gouge.
And then they find, the gouge in this piece that's been separated. And so your theory, I believe, was that that's evidence of tampering. The idea is that perhaps that's where he sliced it to inject whatever drugs or narcotics we're talking about into the meat. And then you've got this contemporary, and we'll bail you out. We'll say this is not at all your theory, but this contemporary says that this particular suspect in question, he was known to be a peeping Tom. We know that, and that he had been kind of brought up on charges of, lewd behavior. Basically, he was kind of soliciting naked pictures from girls. He'd be the kind of guy that would just be sending the dick pics. In today's world, he's that kind of creep, right? But it plays in again very well with this theory because he can spy on everybody ahead of time and kind of get his rocks off. Then he can do this revival. Then he finds the family. He offers them some food. The food's drugged. They go to sleep. He comes in, kills them all. It's a perfect crime. Until your contemporary kind of offers this alternate theory that says no, that there were no drugs involved. He simply cut off a piece of this bacon and put a big slit in it so that he could effectively use it as a sexual aid. Is that a clever way of, yes, a bacon fleshlight, if you will. That's so, right. Right. And that he's kind of just getting his jollies off by humping this bacon American Pie style in front of all his victims, which is gruesome and horrific and still kind of a little funny every time I think about it.
I mean, you hear that sort of thing, and it could have very much been in Reaper Madness as well. Well, that's what happens if you
exactly. You start having sex with bacon. I don't. Though to be fair, if like right now, like when you drop these books off to me, you know, we did the quarantine thing where you let me know when you were coming and you dropped them off, and then I waited till you were gone, and then I stepped out to the porch and picked them up, and we were all safely social distanced, and that's been kind of how I've been doing it for the last month. But if somebody tomorrow said, I'm bringing you 5 pounds of bacon, I mean, that guy I might meet at the door. I don't know. I mean, that's a pretty good draw.
Well, that's why I figured the family ate it. I mean, who doesn't love bacon?
Exactly. Right.
But yeah, my contemporary, my colleague was very much convinced that the killer was so sexually aroused by the ritualistic murder that he had to pleasure himself in the same room. And I don't know. There's some strange things happening that we see in Lake Charles, like buckets under the bed catching human blood.
Well, right. So they could put the messages on the wall and everything else, right?
Right. Yeah. So there's that, but I'm telling you, there's things that this man, Reverend Kelly, does that you think, oh, it's got to be him. It's him. It's
right.
Definitely him. But then he walks.
Yeah.
No one's ever brought to justice for this heinous, serious, the largest unsolved serial killing in U.S. history.
Yeah. So this is what I wanted to ask you about. When you fast forward 6 years to the New Orleans murders, and again, I'm kind of with you. I don't believe that these murders are committed by the same individual. Though I want to come back to Reverend Kelly in just a second. But one of the things that always struck me about the murders in New Orleans is, again, the MO is just a guy breaks into a house, tries to kill everybody with an axe, leaves. And again, just as you say, he typically uses the axe that is in the home. He doesn't bring his own. He uses the family's. It's more or less the same MO as far as the killing style goes. But the sort of most chilling detail about those murders is the way he would enter the homes. And so again, the Axeman of New Orleans is described as a fairly tall guy. I mean, the one guy that ever sees a glimpse of him says he's a big, broad-shouldered guy with an axe, and that's as much description as we ever get. And so certainly this would be a guy that's capable of just kicking the door open and murdering everybody very quickly. And yet he goes to this painstaking detail to chisel out panels on the back door. So that presumably, I guess, then he can reach in and unlock the door and let himself in that way. And I've never understood why you would go to that trouble. I mean, I understand sound is an issue, but it just seems like overkill, right? That you're going to such effort where you could probably have just climbed in through a window or anything else like that. And then I read your book and we get to this theory that they're pumping in chloroform or some sort of toxic agent. And I thought, God, that's awfully familiar. It's the same idea. The other thing we talk about is that the back door is very often left open.
Yeah.
And so your assertion was that, if you are pumping in some sort of drug like chloroform, some sort of gas to kind of knock everybody out, then you leave that door open so it airs out, and then there's no evidence of that. And the same thing does happen in New Orleans. We see that where it's a very stealthy entry. It's a very strange entry involving these little holes, and of course, I really do think he just reaches in, unlocks it, opens the door. But there's times where he comes back, closes it, relocks the door, so that when they find the murder scene, it looks like there was never a door open. It's like he went in through this tiny hole that no human being could have possibly fit through, which just then corroborates this idea that he's a supernatural force and a demon and everything else. But it was such a strong similarity that it jumped out at me right away that there's these hints. Maybe he's doing the same thing. Maybe he's knocking everybody out ahead of time and then killing everybody with an axe.
Yeah. And by then, 7 years later, people would have been talking about this. And there may have been I don't think it was the same guy, but I think that people would have read reports about the the drilling of the holes in these homes. I mean, anybody could have read the newspaper back then and picked up on it.
Right.
And yeah, I think that is interesting about the Axeman of New Orleans, and I think that is a similarity too.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah,
and then in doing research, I should point out, and again, I'm just kind of throwing silly ideas at you, but your Reverend Kelly he kind of goes in and out of jail for 5 years following the Villisca murders, right? Like held on some charge and then released, and then picked up on some other small charge and then released. But he finally kind of makes a clean break from law enforcement and the Villisca issue by 1917. I think is the year. And the only reason that stuck out in my head is that then by 1918 is when the murders in New Orleans start.
Oh, yeah, right.
Right.
That's true. Yeah.
And so I was like, well, maybe it is the same guy, and he was just occupied for 5 years, and then he, gets free and clear and decides to pick it up again.
Yeah, and another theory that I sort of suggest is that he traveled the train, and when you'll notice that when there's murders happening in the South, during the winter, and then during the summer the murders happen up north.
Oh right, yeah, the snowbird theory.
Snowbird
theory. Yeah.
So and that was, he was certainly a man of leisure, certainly traveling the rails with his wife. His wife was very suspicious to me as well, and there's some creepy pictures of those two together. But that's another thing that my book I think offers is, like, you get to see the old headlines back in the day, and you get to see pictures of this. It's not well known, but I hope it gets there. I hope people become obsessed with it as much as I have. I
want to see more. Because again, I can't believe that with these 45, 50 some odd murders that happened before 1918.
Yeah.
I can't believe we're so fixated on these attacks that happened, 6 years later. And the only thing I can think of is twofold. It's number one, that these murders take place in New Orleans, and of course we're the city in Louisiana everybody has their eye on. And then of course we get this silly, we have this sort of silly letter that gets sent out about the jazz music. And I think it's those two things that sensationalize those murders, and somehow all of the ones that came before just fall off the radar. I mean, they're literally never brought up.
I even think so. I even think 1917 is pretty very much early stages of jazz. And from what I understand of New Orleans history, like, it wasn't like widely accepted in probably that year. So but it's very New Orleans, and that's another reason why it persists. And then American Horror Story didn't help, and the reason my man got lost is because of the damn Titanic.
Right.
The Titanic, but then after the Titanic, years later, after that smoke was cleared, then it starts happening again in New Orleans on a much smaller scale.
Right. Well, my good friend, the first interview we did was a friend of mine named Paul Knopfsinger, and he's a magician that deals with bizarre, supernatural, paranormal events, and there's a whole genre of stage magic that revolves around those subjects. And the joke in that community is that the three things you never want to talk about, because literally everybody does them, are Jack the Ripper, Edgar Allan Poe, and the Titanic. Because those are the three. Like, if you're going to talk about ghosts, if I'm going to bring out a coin and say this coin was brought, it's going to be from the Titanic. And that's how we all know 1888, because again, that year is just sort of seared into all our memories as the Victorian year that everything kind of goes haywire. Right. So yeah, I mean, we can blame the Titanic for one more thing. That's just fine with me. So I see a question that popped up in the comments. We got one that says, after being immersed in research of such a macabre series of events, do you have a ritual of sort to kind of clear your head and come back to a happier state of mind? How'd you research all these murders and still be the well-adjusted person you are today?
It's a lot of alcohol.
Oh, yeah, exactly. You see me drinking as we're talking, right?
This interview brought to you by Tito's.
Oh, you've got Tito's. I'm still rocking the Tower 56 bourbon straight from Greeley, Colorado. Yeah, this has been featured several times now in our little webisodes here.
No, it's a good question from this person, and let me just say, yeah, while I was writing it, and then shortly after it was published, when you have the imagery, and you're supposed to kind of create the pictures for the reader, so you have to sort of envision murdered infants and things like that.
Right.
It's just awful. But I really think that the way I broke free from that was I made myself write another book, like quickly, like.
And that was the kids' book. No, I'm just
like to kind of purge it. But I had to write this book because I was just fixated on this story for years, and I didn't. And thankfully, I can say this: Chris Milligan with Trine Day Publishers out of Oregon, had enough sense to see the light in publishing this. And the guy that they got to do the forward, Peter Levenda, you should read some of his books. In fact, you may have.
I think I can probably grab one back here somewhere.
Peter Levenda is also supposedly the guy who wrote the Necronomicon. And you can ask him. He kind of plays with that because
that one TC's within arm's reach. I mean, I'm just saying.
He allegedly wrote that, but I liked his forward, and I appreciated the forward and the publisher. This was my second book, so the first book was my JFK connection to Louisiana, and it was a very small book. I mean, I was a small town Eunice, Louisiana newspaper journalist, and I wrote this feature story on the JFK assassination, and it kind of went viral around the time of the anniversary, the 50th anniversary. And I was approached by Trine Day Publishing, and they said, "Well, do you have enough for a book?" And I said, "Well, maybe." And I barely had enough for a book. My first book is not a big book, but it's a huge story. I'll say that.
And that's I know the name of the woman. But this is a Rose by any other name. Is that the name of it?
Any other names? Yeah.
Yeah.
JFK, and here's a copy of the book.
Oh, there you go. A Rose by many other names. There you go.
Yeah. So then he asked me after this one was sold and published. After I did my Kennedy book, he was like, "Well, you got anything else?" I was like, "Well, I've been working on this series of unsolved axe murders."
Yeah. What can you do for me? Right.
Right. Let's go with it. And I'm just glad that he did, because some of my colleagues, Professor Daniel Schnoop Wyatt, he told me once, he said, this is the first book anybody's ever written about this. And from this point on, they're going to reference this book as kind of like the Rosetta Stone.
I mean, that's it. You really were. That's it. And again, it and I'll say this over and over, I'm sure, but it baffles me that it's not been discussed before now. So credit to you for bringing it to light.
Yeah, and I hope Professor Wyatt writes his book, and anybody else who wants to do the research writes their book. I don't care. I think everybody should research the dark underbelly of American history.
Right. Well, and I will say, for those of you that love true crime and these sorts of books, not only is it well written, but you did us the favor really of putting all of those old newspaper articles in there. So the last last dozen pages of the book, I think, are just primary references. The newspaper articles you were pulling. There's a great timeline, which I found really, really useful as I was going back and trying to connect the same dots that you were. So, and I know that in a lot of true crime books, they leave that out. It's like the writer looks at the evidence, interprets it, and then writes this narrative for all of us to read and be entertained by. And you did that, but also showed us all of the material that you drew from to do that. And for anybody that wants to do more research and kind of follow in your footsteps and carry on that investigation, you just saved them a ton of time, right? So yeah, absolutely.
I think the publisher and I agreed that a timeline would help make sense of how rapidly these things were happening too. I mean, you're looking at a new wholesale murder every 2 weeks.
Right.
It's crazy.
Well, like I said, what I loved about it reading it is that you really do get that sense of the sort of confusion and just the sense of being overwhelmed that all of the investigators have, because again, sometimes they don't know about the murders that happened before. They're investigating just the murders that happened in their locality, and then as they start to expand that investigation, they realize, oh my God, this happened in Crawley, Louisiana, 4 weeks earlier. And so it is. And we have the benefit of hindsight where we can look at it in a very linear, sort of connect the dots kind of way. But in the moments that those were going on, of course, that just wasn't possible. You're dealing with the here and now.
The thing was Louisiana is kind of stuck in time,
That's definitely.
When I went back to go and walk the actual crime scenes and where these houses were in neighborhoods, I mean, they're still terrible, just awful, and I don't think they've ever improved since the time of the accident. And I think I found the house where one of these murders happened.
Yeah, one of them, the house looks like it's unchanged since 100 years ago.
And I showed the close proximity of the railroad right there.
Right there.
20 yards away from that house. It's very eerie.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, I went and knocked on this front door and said, "Hi, I'm Todd Elliott. I wrote a book about horrible murders that happened here in this house.
Can we chat? Right. Can I buy you a cup of coffee? Right. Yeah. I brought you 5 pounds of bacon for your house. No.
Yeah. But and it's just I didn't have a lot of people to interview. Of course, everyone's dead. Mm-hmm. But I was glad that I did get some of the interviews and spoke to some of the people that I did who, in the Black community, they remember being told by their grandparents or great-grandparents about the Axeman.
I love that. Towards the end of the book, when you talk about that, when you're going into these communities and you're sort of, your method is you just go and find the oldest person in the neighborhood. Yeah. Say, where's that person that's 95 years old and has sat on the same front porch for those that, that whole century, and just, you would go to them and just tell them, what do you remember? I know you weren't there, but was it being talked about? And I remember the one that said even in the 1920s, 15, 20 years later, it was still not just a story that was kind of told, around the campfire to scare people, but it was still a story of concern in these communities. Oh, yeah. That even 20 years after the murders, that the sort of specter of the Axeman still lingers over these places, and they were worried about a return of this murderer or... Yeah, that reality, what to us is sort of this mythic figure, for them is a very real boogeyman with real world consequences. Oh, yeah. And so that was wild as well. So I have a question for you. I'm always curious about this. Did any murder weapons survive? Are there any axes that are in a museum somewhere?
Not to my knowledge, but I would speculate that probably some of those axes are still around somewhere.
Somewhere, right? But finding it, that's my other thing. Tracking down that sort of history, those sort of pieces of history. Right. So I would love to get myself on. I don't even want a blade. I think maybe having the blade would be too far, but I'll take the handle. Right? Just give me a haft of an axe that at one point was held by the Axeman, and that would be a crazy piece of history to hold.
Yeah, I mean. Get a metal detector. Go walk some of these old neighborhoods. Yeah, I'd love to. If anybody has anything like that, at least the blade would have survived over the years.
Yeah, at the very least, right? But as far as I know, unlike, and that's something that's very interesting. When Jack the Ripper happens in England, there's this culture of sort of paraphernalia that pops up almost immediately. Where people are taking the crime photos of these victims and almost trading them like baseball cards. You would collect these different photos and trade them with people. And we just don't see that here in these cases. And I think part of that is that, we're not in Victorian London. We're in middle of nowhere, Louisiana in the early 20th century. And it didn't draw the same kind of press attention that Jack does, that some of these other serial killers do. And also, we got to talk about the racial aspect of that, right?
Yeah.
Black and mixed race families getting murdered in the rural parts of Louisiana is not as compelling of a story back then, as tragic as that is to say. But there's definitely a racial mindset, which is why the Iowa murders, I think, are so impactful when it is finally a white family that dies. Right. And now everybody's up in arms because, of course, now it's important. Right.
Right. Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, it's quite a story. It will give you nightmares, I think, and but again, the dark underbelly of history is sometimes stranger. I'd say this truth is stranger than fiction.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Well, that's something I know that you and I have in common as tour guides. Is that so much of the supernatural, paranormal, this dark side of New Orleans history, it's true, but only to a point. You look at American Horror Story Coven as a great example. These stories have gotten so much attention that they've now been embellished on and kind of rewritten and retold so many times that it's hard to separate fact from fiction. The LaLaurie story is the quintessential example, right? 90% of the LaLaurie story may or may not have happened, right? And the ghost tours have just run with it anyway. And that's not to say there's definitely something awful that happened at that house.
Oh yeah,
but
you're telling me she didn't get put in a coffin and live for another 100 years and be brought back into
buried alive by Marie Laveau? No, I actually got that question on my voodoo tour all the time. You and I used to cross paths every day on my voodoo tour. You would be heading up to Dog Park, and I would be coming away from it. And I can't tell you how many times I was asked if Marie Laveau and Delphine LaLaurie really knew one another. And I would go, the truthful answer is we don't know.
I always said this. I said people might have learned about Delphine LaLaurie later, but everybody knew Marie. Everybody knew Marie.
Well, and that's by 1834, which is when the LaLaurie fire happens. When that whole event goes down. Marie Laveau, by our best guess, is 33 years old. She's ascended in that moment. Her early 30s is kind of when she starts hitting her stride. But it wasn't as if she had been the voodoo queen of New Orleans for the 25 years. Because when you look at it, it's like, oh, Delphine and Marie must have had this long-standing, kind of Elizabeth Bathory, I'm going to make you eternally young deal for years beforehand. And I'm like, well, she just wasn't in business that long. So that's what I usually tell people. I say, the timing just doesn't quite line up the way you would really want it to for that to be true.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
You know what I find interesting, and here we go. We're going to kind of nerd out.
But by all means, this is what the people came for.
Nerding out as New Orleans tour guides.
Yep.
I find it fascinating that three powerful female figures in history were all in the city at the same time. You have Marie Laveau, Madame Marie Delphine LaLaurie, and the Baroness Pontalba.
Right. I knew that was going to be your third. I mean, how do you not bring her up? Right.
Wow. There's a series. There's a Netflix series right there.
Oh my gosh. I mean, one of my proudest and most heartbreaking moments is, and I don't know if you remember this from way back, but every November, every December, we do here in New Orleans what's called I think now it's called the Louisiana History Alive. It used to be called the Louisiana Living History Project. And these are the cats that dress up like Marie Laveau or Andrew Jackson or Baroness Pontalba. So if you ever visit us in November, basically there are these people who have studied these historical figures so closely that they can effectively adopt their personality. They walk around the streets of the French Quarter, and if you bump into them, you can ask them questions, and they will respond in character. They know the history well enough. So if you ever wanted to talk to, Andrew Jackson about the Battle of New Orleans, or Marie Laveau about what she actually did for a living, and I forget, it's Christine Velez who writes the biography of Pontalba, the Intimate Enemies book. Yeah. And she said,
she's one of my favorites.
Oh, I love that book. It's an amazing book. And at one point, I believe she was quoted as saying the only person that knew more about Baroness Pontalba than she did is the woman that plays her in the Louisiana History Alive. And so There was a pretty tragic event a few years back where the woman that played Josie Arlington, the Madam of Storyville, who was also their costume designer, a gal named Veronica, she passed away. And when she passed away, the whole company kind of took a year to figure out how to go forward after her passing. And so there's my pride and tragedy is that just before she passed, I had been approved as Bernard de Marigny in that project. And then when the costume designer passed, they just didn't have anybody else that could make the appropriate costumes, because you have to tailor it to the person. You know, it's not like they had a costume hanging in a closet and I just put it on and assumed the character. They had to build it specifically to me. And so it wound up cutting the company's production budget quite a bit and just never came about. Otherwise, in November, I could have been Bernard de Marigny walking around the French Quarter. And that's another guy that, again, is alive way through that. I mean, Marigny stays alive forever. He sees everything in this town.
Yeah.
But I love that confluence. Yeah, you're right. Of all of these historical figures, both sort of famous and notorious, that are wandering around the city at the same time in that kind of mid 1800s.
And the only like research I've seen that sort of connects Fontalba to like Marie Laveau was the Carolyn Long.
Mm-hmm, sure, Carolyn Moore Long, right?
On Marie Laveau, and her grandmother's address is actually one of the what is now the Fontalba buildings, but before they were ramshackle.
Wow, right.
So at one point, you know, Marie Laveau's grandmother is a landlord, and it's Fontalba.
Mm-hmm. Is that Marguerite? Is that her name?
You know, I think so.
I should know, but yeah, I think that's the case, right? So let me see if we've got any other questions. They're being uncharacteristically silent. I can't see how many people are watching. I know you.
No, I know the answers to any of the questions.
Right. They're worried to ask you. They're like, we don't want to expose ourselves as the serial killers. We all are. I do want to say, I think a good friend of mine, I hope he's still watching. So again, my buddy Paul, who's from Colorado and is just such a fabulous magician. He's a big historian, kind of historical nerd. If you watch the first episode, he tracked down a blue book, like an actual blue book, which kind of kills me. But I know, because he's one of my best friends, and this is totally off subject. We're going to veer off for a second. Okay. But you and I are Facebook friends, and I noticed you just found a Lake Charles Bill Hicks connection.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So speaking as a Lake Charles historian, give me 5 minutes on Bill Hicks' worst comedy show ever. Because if you don't know Bill Hicks, for those of y'all that are watching, he is by far one of the best stand-up comedians of all time. Yeah, dies too young. You know, he's another one like that where he died young. I think he had cancer, prostate cancer, I think.
Yeah. He's usually right up there with Charlie and Richard Pryor.
Right. Sam Kinison, all those guys, right. If you've listened to any of Dennis Leary's early stuff, that's basically, he just stole all of Bill Hicks' material after Bill died. So
yeah, he did.
Right. So tell me about this, because all I saw was your brief mention of it on Facebook, and I want to know about this comedy routine.
So I had just discovered, I'm a huge Bill Hicks fan. Never would have thought that Bill Hicks would have played my hometown of Lake Charles.
Right.
Which, by the way, in the 1980s was probably a more jumping place.
Was probably what? I didn't hear it.
There's more of a jumping place in the 1980s.
Really? You think so?
More of a happening place. Because there's nothing to do there now. But and everybody knows Lake Charles is such a small town that we have like one of the everything, and the gay bar was known as Crystals, and that's the only gay bar in town. Everybody knows it's Crystals. And so I come across this video where Bill Hicks is talking about the worst gig he ever played in his life was in Lake Charles, Louisiana, at a club called Oscars. And I was like, where the hell was Oscars?
Yeah, right.
So I started asking my Facebook friends, and I have this great lady, Ivy, Miss Ivy. Hi, Miss Ivy. We're Facebook friends. She was like, she thought I was trolling her, like, with questions. Does anybody remember where Oscars would have been in Lake Charles? He's like, that was the old Crystal. That's where we used to go all the time. And I was like, oh, okay, wow.
I love it.
Yeah. So I'm trying to get Jeff Derwin, who's a New Orleans comedian now, is also from Lake Charles.
Mm-hmm.
He and we're going to try to get it like a GoFundMe to get a placard put up at Crystal's in Lake Charles saying that Bill Hicks plays worst show ever.
That'd be amazing.
And of course, knowing Bill, there was some acid involved, of course, so they're stuck at this this place in Lake Charles, which, when he talks about the audience and how they are, and the nightclub owner comes up and grabs the mic and says, I paid a lot of money for these guys, comedians from Houston, so you better laugh, goddammit. That's Lake Charles in a nutshell. And no one's paying attention to Bill Hicks.
Right.
And I'm just like, oh my God. And they're heckling and they're rude to the comedians. And Bill's like, we had 2 nights there. 2 nights.
Oh, no.
The second night, Bill and the other comedian, they all take acid. And so they're sitting in the back of the club, probably tripping balls. And one guy's doing his bit. Again, he's on the stage, first comedian up there. And some guy goes, are you going to actually be funny tonight? And the comedian says, like, yeah, sir, of course. He's like, good, because I brought my gun with me. Again, Charles,
Right. Yeah, I mean, they're not kidding around when they say that, right?
Right. And describes the atmosphere of Oscars as a redneck disco back in the day. Then the waitress comes up, what's wrong? And she's like, well, this guy at the bar just said he was armed with comedians. She's like, oh, don't worry, honey. I brought my gun, too, in case it gets out of hand. And so Bill's tripping on acid going, oh, my God, they're armed and they're dumb.
Oh, my gosh. Right. And Bill is a pretty anti-gun, he leans way, way, way left.
Yeah.
When it comes to politics. So standing up and doing his bits in Lake Charles, Louisiana was already dangerous to begin with.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then it all culminates with Bill's on stage. This is Bill Hicks, mind you.
Right.
Bill's on stage and some guy, some jerk just comes up to the stage and hangs out and just looking at Bill, and Bill looks at him and goes like, can I help you, sir? And the guy just pulls the plug, pulls the mic cable, pulls the plug on the microphone, and Bill's like, well, I guess that's it, folks. And on Bill Hicks, they did.
Yeah, I got paid. I'm gonna take off. Right.
Internationally known comedian.
Unbelievable.
He was like a rock star comic because he had to go to England to get famous. Really.
Well, and he was Texan too, so he should have been able to handle it. But again, like I said, lean pretty far left. So in Lake Charles, when they start showing you off their firearms, I would be a little worried as well.
Not much has changed.
Yeah. So we got another question in the comments, and I'll just touch on it briefly. So Mark Aspiaso says, no doubt the Gallatin Street characters are on your list of 19th century underground characters as well. So the answer is yes, of course, but that's clearly another tour guide because only tour guides would know about Gallatin Street.
Now, one thing about Gallatin Street that's interesting that I always wanted to kind of do some research on, I think somebody told me this once, but there was historically, I forgot who wrote this, Buddy Stahl maybe wrote this.
Okay.
And he said that there used to be a bar on Gallatin Street, so rough and tumble, so terrible, that I think it was called The Undertaker or something, and they actually had a coffin, a tomb behind the bar. Have you ever heard of this?
No, I've never heard of this.
Like a brick oven tomb, supposedly in this bar, and they kept the booze in coffin, and they would take it out and stuff. Really weird. I'll have to show you that. It's in a book, I'll say this: it's not outside the realm of possibilities. Certainly, they could have been that crazy. I would love to see that because then, when you think about it, that would be the first kind of, sort of spirits on bourbon bar that existed in New Orleans. Right? We're gonna bank on that, coffin Undertaker. You may not make it out of this alive theme, and somehow capitalize off of that. No, my favorite story always, of course, whenever you talk about Gallatin Street, you got to bring up Bricktop.
who's for those of y'all not to know, Bricktop was and obviously Todd, correct me if I'm wrong here, but a prostitute. She was called Bricktop because she had red hair. She allegedly carried something like half a dozen knives on her person at all times, stashed in God knows where, and then would run around with one of her, I don't know, boyfriends or henchmen or something, who was a Civil War vet that had one arm amputated,
right,
and replaced with a ball and chain.
Right.
So not like a hook-handed killer, but a literal like spiked ball and chain kind of dude. And these are the sorts of characters that roam around what is now the French Market in New Orleans in the mid 1800s. And I love that concept because it's one of those, it's too unbelievable to be true, and yet like we have records of these people there. They talk about them. I've never seen a picture. I'd love to get a picture of a guy with the ball and chain arm. Yeah, I don't know that he ever posed for it. That's a question I meant to ask you. And I'm gonna. One of our guides, Bert, chimed in and said everything we're describing just sounds like the dungeon. Now, the dungeon's a lot tamer than Gallatin Street, right? Especially now. The dungeon pre-Katrina was still tame compared to Gallatin Street, and it's not what it was pre-Katrina these days. No, so those Axeman murders, to go back to that, the one thing I didn't see in your book, and I don't know if they exist, are any sort of crime scene photos. We have a house, but not very many pictures of any crime scenes. Do those exist?
Never seen any, never come across any. I had to sort of employ the help of an artist friend of mine out of Lafayette, Hal Moore, who did the great cover for that.
Oh, it was great. Yeah, great art throughout.
Illustrations, he did some illustrations to give you some, kind of capturing the fear of what people were imagining was happening back then. Mm-hmm. But I don't know if in 1912 they were too keen on crime scene photos, and if they were, they probably didn't survive. The only photos we ever see, because a camera certainly would have been a luxury item,
right? And these are not, we should say, and no disrespect to your hometown, but in the times we're talking about, Lake Charles, Crawley, Beaumont, these are not wealthy towns by any stretch, right?
They just got cameras 5 years ago.
Yeah, exactly. They're not a New Orleans. They're not a Houston. They're not even a Baton Rouge. They're out in the boonies. So,
right. Mm-hmm. And the only way we have pictures of where the murders took place and the pictures of the suspects were because of a traveling journalist.
Because of the reporters. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, and that was the thing. We didn't have internet back then, so reporters actually had to get out and not write travel pieces. Right. Actually go to the places that they covered. And send it back. So, yeah, I was very thankful that, this story would have been totally lost had a journalist not been in the right place at the right time. And America's appetite for this was fueled every week with updates in the newspapers, and that's truly now where the Axeman exists. Well,
and let's give credit where it's due. You say that this wouldn't have come to light if not for these journalists 100 years ago. We wouldn't know about it at all today if not for your book. So credit to you for carrying on their sort of work. Because again, as
I feel like I was kind of finishing someone's work for them and carrying on.
Mm-hmm. Well, even as, like I said, a scholar of the macabre, as somebody that collects New Orleans ghost stories, literally professionally for a living, until I cracked your book, I had never heard of all of these other murders. And so, just a great read. Absolutely. By all means, we've got, I think, half a dozen copies that are signed by the author you can pick up in our shop. I'm going to have to get your Rose by Many Other Names book at some point. I don't suppose you know a fellow named Ray Cannata, do you?
Ray Cannata?
Mm-hmm. He's a member of my crew of the Rolling Elvi. He's another Elvi, but he is maybe the most the guy I know who is most intrigued, most interested, knows the most about all of the JFK conspiracy in New Orleans. And not just the Lee Harvey Oswald, sort of Marcello family stuff that we all kind of are aware of, right? But gets into the Dr. Mary's monkey and the bizarre cancer treatments and like all of that stuff. Clay Shaw and just everybody. And so it's funny because Ray, bless his heart, if you ask him about it, the good news is he's going to answer you. The bad news is an hour later he's still going to be answering you because it's one of those kind of subjects. But I should absolutely connect y'all at some point because I know if he hasn't, I'd be surprised if he hasn't read that book already. And if he has read it, I'm sure he's got opinions he'd want to share with you. Yeah.
Rose Cheramy was just another little chapter in the sort of oddball history, unearthed history of New Orleans, of America. And if you look there, see, there's Rose.
Oh, that's Rose. I wondered who that face was kind of looming behind you this whole time.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So that's her New Orleans mugshot, actually.
Right.
And then when you do research and you find out, wow, here's a woman who had foreknowledge 48 hours before Kennedy was assassinated, a French Quarter dweller, lived on, Esplanade. Her house is still at Esplanade. And right around the corner from, Clay Shaw's home.
Uh-huh.
Like, wow, there's just...
The Zeke house, all that mess, right? Well, I'll say this. My one little personal contribution to the Kennedy conspiracies is this, and I'll try to I'll be vague here so as to protect some identities. But my very first girlfriend in college, her middle name, I figure that's not identifiable. Her middle name was Fairchild, and her father named her that not because of Morgan Fairchild or anything. That was the name of his favorite plane that he used to run drugs in back in the so this guy, her dad, we think was literally a smuggler, literally a drug runner, running back and forth from Cuba and some of the other Caribbean islands and Mexico back to LA and California. And so I'll say he obviously, even if half of what he said is true, he lived a very colorful life. And what my girlfriend would tell me is that every once in a while he would get kind of blackout drunk and start talking about Cuba, Kennedy assassination, and like it was clear the guy knew something, and it would only ever kind of slip out when he was that drunk, and then he would catch himself, he would clam up and never speak of it again. But I firmly believe, there's at least a Cuban connection, if nothing else. And of course, the Kennedy assassination in New Orleans, like the Axeman murders, I think it's a rabbit hole that just keeps getting deeper and deeper the more you look into it.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Even Dr. Mary's monkey. I mean, we get into literally bioweapons and the notion that cancer itself was manufactured in a lab, and that has something to. I mean, it gets so out there that you're waiting for the Pleiadians to descend and tell you, oh, we organized all this from Venus. But it's baffling, and so yours. But again, until the Rose by many other names, Rose Cheramy had not crossed my desk. So it's another. You've got this knack of finding these overlooked places and kind of bringing them to light for us. So
told by a lot of my colleagues, JFK authors, that we'll never have enough for a book on Rose. There's just not enough.
Mm-hmm.
And I barely did. But I'm the first person to really write just about a book about her, and she's kind of a footnote in the Kennedy assassination. I just wanted to do my part for put my brick in the wall. There's so many of these JFK books, and I will never, nor do I ever, want to write another.
Why is that? I'm just curious.
It just comes with too much. Too much baggage that comes with writing a Kennedy assassination.
Mm-hmm.
Too much weird shit.
Well, and now I feel like, what do they say? Separating the wheat from the chaff, right? I feel like there's so many theories out there that are just so far off the reservation that to kind of filter all those out is an undertaking unto itself before you get into the stuff that's usable information.
Yeah, keep muddying the waters, nothing will ever be clear.
Right.
And I think we probably already heard how it happened. I believe somebody's already put that theory.
We just don't know which one it is exactly.
We just don't. We choose to believe what we choose to believe, and that's the thing about all these Kennedy assassination buffs and authors, they all have a theory, and all of their theories are correct. Well, that can't possibly be. So, I don't want to write another Kennedy book. I did my part. I'm done. I started working on fiction, and I have one called The 70 Lines and The Lower Line. The Lower Line is a New Orleans ghost story set in New Orleans, and I did a book opening signing at Garden District Books. You can pick it up at Garden District Books right now if they're open.
God knows, yeah. Who knows what's open? Curbside pickup at the rink, but who knows?
But Amazon, of course.
Right.
Always the book. But I'm working on another series of short stories. Like I'm doing an anthology of horror stories, and I think this may be the last bit of horror that I do. The Lower Line is not really horror so much as it's kind of a modern day gothic thriller, ghosts, and based on my first encounter or experience with what I believe was seeing a ghost, and some of it still inspired by my first weird ghostly experience in the French Quarter.
Well, now I'm here for that. So if you don't mind, share. We got about 10 minutes left before we're going to call it a night.
Okay. So I kind of I'll start with the French Quarter incident that happened. I was staying at Hotel Saint Pierre.
Oh, sure.
Incredibly haunted place, from what I understand now.
Well, sits so again for people outside of New Orleans, the Hotel Saint Pierre sits literally on the intersection where the gate of our original cemetery stood. That was the entrance to our oldest non-existent cemetery, and the people are still there. It was a below-ground cemetery, so that block is still filled with dead people. It's just that there's no longer gravestones. So, yeah, you're already at ground zero as far as hauntings go.
Yeah, they put me in the King Suite the first night, and then they had to move me the second night to what looked like little, like kind of cabins in the back. So I stayed in that room. I was going to sleep, and I wasn't not asleep. I know for a fact I was not asleep. And I do this thing where I go to sleep and I hang my hand off the headboard side of the bed, like I hang it down below.
You're a brave man.
Yes. Dangle into the creepy nether.
Yeah, right.
And so as I'm starting to finally unwind and relax, I swear to God, I felt a cold, wet, clammy hand from under the bed.
Right.
And I jumped up out of bed. And my kids, and I yell at my kids, like, "Oh, did you do something?" Trying to blame.
Yeah, right. How'd you grab my hand from behind the headboard?
Because when you think something cold and clammy under your bed, maybe dead, you think maybe it's New Orleans, it's the French Quarter. First thing I thought was, oh God, it's a dead hooker or something.
You're close. You're not quite on Iberville yet, but you're moving that direction, right?
But I didn't know my mind racing.
Right. You just try to find some sort of rational explanation for it.
I know I felt someone has cupped my hand, grasped my hand. That was one of the strangest things that's ever happened to me. I will say that.
So wait, one of my other guys, Ty, just brought something up. Are we talking the Hotel Saint Pierre on Dumaine and Burgundy, which is different? Okay, I thought you were talking about the Inn on St. Peter, which is a different place entirely. Yeah.
No, Inn on St. Peter, interesting history. Johnny Thunders of the New York Dolls died there. Sort of, then when they found his body contorted under the coffee table, that's very strange. And I remember I was going to stay there one Halloween with a bunch of my punk rock friends. And we never did. But I got the room. They changed the number over the years.
Right.
So, and then the Lower Line recounts my first experience with what I thought seeing a ghost was in Eunice, Louisiana, where I was living at the time. And I was staying in between residences. I was staying at a motor inn, and very vivid, like paranormal experience, a manifestation, sort of strange, dark spectral apparition that appeared to me
Oh, wow.
very early in the morning. So much so that the weirdest thing was I was sleeping, but I woke myself up. I was speaking to this thing in my room, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I just remember hearing my own voice saying, "You're not real. You're not real. You're not real." And I woke myself up saying that, and I was becoming cognizant of who am I saying this to? And when I became aware, I noticed this thing in my room was getting more and more pissed every time I said, "You're not real."
Oh boy, right.
Yeah. And so I literally had to ask management, somebody in my room, housekeeping,
Wow.
something like that. What I thought was interesting, I had just started transcendental meditation. So in a way, I thought it was like my body's natural reaction, sort of like wake up.
Right. We can talk about hypnagogic hallucinations and everything else. Sure.
And so I couldn't explain it. That's never happened before. Kind of like a sleep paralysis thing that happens too when some people see ghosts. And I think that's what I was experiencing.
Mm-hmm.
But I wrote about that as sort of the inspiration for the Lower Line, which is actually a real place on Lower Line Street.
Right. Yeah, I'm familiar with the street, but it's not I've read yet. So now I'm going to have to pick that one up.
Yeah.
So to close out, since we got, go ahead. I'm sorry.
One flying burritos is in that.
It's got to be good, right?
Some of the places are gone though now. When I wrote it, there was a lot of other, some restaurants coming.
So let me just call out to everybody else, folks. If you're watching, this is our last call for questions. If you got any questions at all about the accident, paranormal activity, whatever you like, fire them out now. I'm going to say we were talking just before we started the live event about this house in Iowa, in Villisca, Iowa. So the last, as far as we know, the last real Axeman murders of 1912. And apparently that house is still there.
Yep.
And is now a bed and breakfast.
It is. And you can spend the night there. I'm very keen on trying to do a book signing there. And I want to introduce a lot of the locals to my Axeman, who I believe is the same Axeman.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, so this is my question for you. So it's God knows when we'll be able to actually leave our homes and travel to Iowa again. But whenever that happens, and now that I know, see, it's funny. I knew you as a investigator, as a historian. I did not know that you had paranormal experiences of your own. So with that in mind, would you be up for, if we could arrange it in the future, a combination book signing / seance at the Villisca House in Iowa?
Wow. Yeah, that'd be awesome.
I mean, why not just ask the people directly, was it Reverend Kelly or wasn't it? And see if we can get any kind of answer there.
That's a great idea.
All right, so there you go. That's our wish list item for post quarantine. We're gonna do some sort of ghost hunt event at the Villisca, Iowa Axeman House. You heard it here first in this random little Facebook Live podcast. Otherwise, until that happens, so Ty, you're working on a new book, which I think is a children's book, right?
Yeah.
Nice changes.
Before my horology comes out, I will have a children's book out. And it's a kind of a Louisiana kids book. It's really for the kids that are like quarantined right now. They're going to be spending a lot of time indoors this summer.
Right.
So it's a children's story and coloring book. The artwork in there is unfinished, so I want the kids to color the book. And,
cool.
Yeah, it's about a dog named Rue. In fact, that's the name of it, right?
Nice.
Dog named Rue.
There you go.
So, yeah.
Now you have a kid of your own, huh?
Teenager, so.
Oh, teenager. How's the homeschooling going?
It's gone, actually.
I told my wife, we don't have kids, but I said, if we did, there would be no fractions in this house. Homeschooling would be, I'm going to teach you how to make a roux, and we're going to study some serial killers, and we might spend 2 weeks on ancient Egypt, but yeah, there's going to be no quote standard learning. Yeah, so I just wondered what that was like in the Elliott household. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's like I said, it's kids in Louisiana. Man, they're all more than most kids. They get off for Mardi Gras. Now they get off the rest of the year.
Oh, we got more breaks than you could believe, right?
Oh yeah. But
Yeah.
now school is canceled for the rest of the year, so my kid's just like, well, summer's here early, so you know.
Yeah, I guess so. It would be great if we could go outside. So.
Yeah. What's the most vexing thing about it is, Dad's a writer, right? Journalist. Kid struggles with English. Explain that one.
Oh, Murphy's Law. That's all I know to tell you. Well, so if people are looking for you, where can they find you otherwise? We've got obviously the Axis of Evil book is on our website. You can certainly get it there. shop.nosecretstores.com. But if they're looking for the Rose Cherami book or your fiction books, where can they pick those up?
I would direct everyone to go to author Todd C. Elliott's Facebook page. If you could share that.
Of course, we're going to link that in the comments for everybody. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I mean, I'd be more than happy to send you. I take Venmo, PayPal, and I'm glad to send you like a signed book. But you have some signed books that you need to get rid of. So,
yeah, well, one of them already sold to somebody. I don't know, because he didn't have a signed copy. So I just upgraded my old one for a signed one now. So we now have 5 left, but there are 5 still at the shop. And of course, you and I, we can coordinate delivery of more as demand necessitates. So by all means, y'all look into this. Everything you know, that was the whole point of this episode. Everything you know about the Axeman is the tip of the iceberg. If you only knew about the guy from American Horror Story, you don't know anything. And that's what I came away from this book knowing, is that what I thought was the whole story was just a footnote. And the whole story, the real story, has been hidden all these years. So by all means, y'all pick up Axis of Evil. Visit Tyler Elliott's author page. We'll link that in the notes. Other than that, there's one other thing I want to credit you for before we leave, and that is this big-ass paperweight on my desk. So some people that have heard have taken my voodoo tour with me may have heard me talk about this. This is a paving stone. It's a cobblestone from St. Anne Street from, I'm going to guess, my best guess is this dates to the late 1700s, maybe the early 1800s.
Maybe early 1800s. One of those, I guess paving stones were all ballast stones thrown off of barges and shit.
Oh, I know that. Yeah. Well, what's wild about it, I'm sure that this won't, you won't be able to see this online, but if you look at this side, this is clearly the side that was face down in the dirt. And then when you look at the other side, you can see where it's literally worn smooth by like the horse hooves and people walking over it and things like that. You can feel the literal sort of indentations as people walk down over God knows how many decades. So the story behind this is they've been up Bourbon Street for a year and a half, and we're all tour guides walking around the same, 12 blocks of the French Quarter. And so you had posted on Facebook that they were literally taking these cobblestones or paving stones out of the excavation and throwing them in a dumpster. Because, of course, the construction guys don't know what they're holding. But you and I, being lovers of history, you had commented on it first and said, if there's anybody else that really wants one, now's the time to grab them. And so I think there may be a half dozen of us that managed to get our hands on a rock like this. And I know it's just like a dumb rock, but this is the street that I lived on in the French Quarter for a decade. So it came from St. Anne Street, which is where I lived for so long. Whether you know it or not, every time we would pass each other right by the inn on St. Anne, I literally lived next door to that hotel for a decade. So now my paperweight here at my home office is cobblestone from the street I lived on from 200 years before I lived on it. And I owe that entirely to you, because you were the guy that took us all off in the first place. So credit's deserved. But other that, Todd, it's been fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on this. Guys, Axes of Evil. You got to go buy this book. It's wild. It will terrify you, which is what we all want here. Any final words before we say our goodbyes?
Just keep seeking the truth, and if anyone can ever dig up anything on the Sacrifice Church of New Orleans, please let me know.
Please, yeah. I don't even. That's a whole other. We could talk the weird, culty offshoots of different churches in New Orleans. We were talking about the one on the North Shore before we signed on to live.
Yeah.
But yeah, I love that the Sanctified Church became the Sacrifice Church, which then maybe led us to the Axeman murders. But to really dig into all that, y'all are going to have to book. So again, Todd, thank you so much for coming on. We'll be everybody for a little bit. Oh my goodness, we're getting books delivered to Ireland next week, says Christina Grant. So at least we're spreading the gospel far and wide. And guys, thank you for showing up, for logging in again. Next week, May 1st, we will be dark. I'm taking a week off. A big paranormal convention that is happening over Facebook Live and Zoom and all these other online things. So I'm going to be at that, but we'll be back kind of ready to go on March 7th. I think I'm going to bring a seance worker from the UK that does Jack the Ripper seances. So we're going to talk about the OG serial killer the next session we do. And maybe if I can get him to the U.S. and the timing is all right, we'll bring him to Iowa and see about really tracking down the true identity of the Axeman. So Todd, thanks again for showing up. Everybody, I really appreciate you logging in. We'll say our farewells and we'll next week.
All right, man.
Yep. Take care, y'all. Cheers.